বসা যায় না এখানে, জিনিস করতে পারা যায় না এই বাড়িতে, নিজের ইন্টারেস্ট নেই, বুড়ো হয়ে গেছে সবাই। শেয়ার হচ্ছে না।
Shall we start, ma'am? Dr. Soumya, ma'am?
Yeah.
I will just give an intro and I will start, ma'am.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome all of you to this session on anatomy. Today we have Dr. Soumya Bhattacharya. She is the HOD and professor from ESI Kolkata. She will be delivering talk on cerebellum and fourth ventricle anatomy. If you have any doubts, please type them in the chat section of YouTube channel. Ma'am will be clarifying them at the end of the session. You please share our YouTube channel and Facebook page to all your friends. And we have upcoming session afternoon 5 to 6 evening. We have soft skills on for doctors by Dr. P.S. Sharma, and also in the evening 6:30 to 7:30 we have urea cycle by Dr. Suganti Madam. With this, I hand over it to ma'am. Ma'am, you can share this. I will stop sharing.
Okay, thank you. A very good afternoon to all my students of India Medical College, and I would like to thank Professor Balaji and his team for giving me this opportunity. And my talk for this afternoon is cerebellum and fourth ventricle. Now, as you all know, that cerebellum is a very important structure which is present in the hindbrain, and this is also known as the little brain. Now, the other name for it is the rhombencephalon. So you can see the cerebellum here in this part. Now, it is located in the posterior cranial fossa, and it is basically, when we talk about the bone, it is in the cerebellar fossa of the squamous part of the occipital bone. So, my dear students, you know that posteriorly the occipital bone is located, and if you look in the inner aspect of the bone, you will find there are fossae, and these are for the lodgement of the cerebellum. Cerebellum is very important because it is concerned with the ipsilateral motor control of the body. Now, I emphasize on the two words, ipsilateral and motor. What we understand from ipsilateral is, the word ipsi means same-sided. So, it's on the same-sided control on the body. The antonym for this word is contralateral, and it is more concerned with the motor control on the body. We will see more about it when we do the clinical anatomy. Going to the next slide. So therefore, my dear students, you can see that the cerebellum is located in the hindbrain part. Now, in the occipital lobe, if we concentrate on the diagram which is above on the right hand side, it's a very bright, colorful diagram. You look at the green aspect. The green part is basically the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe of the cerebrum is separated from the cerebellum. Right below is the blue part, which is known as the cerebellum. Now, so this green occipital lobe is separated from this part is the cerebellum by the tentorium cerebelli. Now, this is important that the tentorium cerebelli, the attachment of tentorium cerebelli comes under the meningeal attachments. So, before we proceed, you have to review your knowledge about the falx cerebri, the falx cerebelli, and the tentorium cerebelli. To remind you a little, tentorium cerebelli is like a tent. So it is separating the occipital lobe from the cerebellum. Now, anteriorly, dorsal surface of the pons. So coming to the diagram which is below, identify the parts of the brain stem. You can see the pons, above will be midbrain and below will be the medulla. So this brain stem, right against the pons, you can see the part of the cerebellum. This diagram, the lower diagram, this shows on the right hand side is a cut section of the cerebellum, which is like the branches of a tree. That is why the other name for it is arbor vitae cerebelli. So this is the arbor vitae cerebelli, which resembles the branching pattern of a tree. Now, in between the brainstem and the cerebellum, you can see a triangular white portion, which is known as the fourth ventricle. So therefore, you can see that dorsal surface of the pons and the medulla are separated by the fourth ventricle, against which you can see the arbor vitae cerebelli, that is the cross section of the cerebellum. Going to the next slide, you can see that the gross anatomy of the cerebellum shows two lateral halves or the hemispheres. So you can see that there are two hemispheres on either side, and intermediate part is the elevated portion, which is known as the vermis. So, my dear students, you can see the vermis, you can see the hemispheres. Now, this is basically the superior surface. Go to the diagram below. That is the inferior surface. Therefore, you can see that the cerebellar hemispheres have a superior surface and an inferior surface. The vermis, anterior most part, look at this vermis. Why the name vermis? Can you correlate with the vermiform appendix, which means that it's like a worm? So the anterior most part is the anterosuperior aspect of the vermis, which is known as the superior cerebellar notch. And the posterior inferior aspect, you can see a beautiful notch, which is known as the posterior cerebellar notch, and over here we give the attachment to falx cerebelli. Therefore, my dear students, you have seen that cerebellum has relations with two meningeal attachments, the falx cerebelli on the posterior cerebellar notch and the tentorium cerebelli, differentiating it from the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Now coming to the superior surface of the cerebellum. Now this superior surface of the cerebellum has a central vermis. We have already learned it. The central vermis is the most elevated part, and on either side of it, you have the cerebellar hemispheres. So this is like a midline reach, That there are narrow and shallow linear depressions. Now these are known as fissures. Fissures are like grooves or narrow depressions. These are linear in nature. There are three fissures. One is the primary fissure, the other is the horizontal fissure, the third is the posterolateral fissure. So the primary fissure, coming to the primary fissure, you can see beautifully that there are some cerebellar hemisphere part and some parts on the vermis. In between the primary fissure and the horizontal fissure, we have some part of the lobe. This lobe is known as posterior or middle lobe. Between horizontal fissure and the posterolateral fissure or the sulcus, you have certain other lobes. These are also part of the posterior or middle lobe. Therefore, my dear students, I would like to draw your attention to this part. That is, cerebellum has three fissures. Primary fissure, which is otherwise known as fissura prima. It has horizontal fissure, which is through and through. It cuts the cerebellum through and through. And posteriorly is the posterolateral fissure or the posterolateral sulcus. Therefore, there are three fissures. And now let us see the lobes. Anterior to primary fissure is the anterior lobe. Between primary fissure, horizontal fissure, and posterolateral sulcus, we have the posterior lobe or the middle lobe. And behind the posterolateral fissure, there is a flocculus, that is, you can see it looks like the tree with a stem, which we call a flocculonodular lobe. So there are three lobes and three fissures and two surfaces. Now, this we are talking when we are discussing the superior surface. So if I have to quickly review what we learned in the superior surface, that on the superior aspect, we can see the parts of the vermis, we can see the corresponding cerebellar hemispheres, we can see the anterosuperior notch, we can see the primary fissure or fissura prima. Anterior to it is the anterior lobe. Then we can identify the horizontal fissure, and sidewise we can see the posterior lobe up to the posterolateral fissure, and behind it is the flocculonodular lobe. Now this is all about the superior surface. We have to learn a little more. Now, my dear students, in the end, I have already given a few probable questions which you need to practice. Now, these are all must-know areas. You can't skip this before your exams. Coming to the inferior surface. Now, inferior surface, the vermis superiorly looks like a vallecula or a depression. So the vermis, we call it vermis when it is superior surface. When it is inferior surface, it is known as vallecula. Now, my dear students, how do you hold cerebellum anatomically? You hold it with your two palms. So both the hemispheres rest on the right and the left palm. And the two lateral borders, the medial borders of the palm fusing will hold the vermis or the vallecula. So the superior and inferior halves of middle lobe is entirely separated by the horizontal fissure. That is why I have said that the horizontal fissure cuts through the entire aspect of the cerebellum. Therefore, it is very easy. When you hold it, your examiner will ask you to identify the anterior lobe, the fissura prima, the horizontal fissure, the posterior lobe, the posterolateral sulcus, and if your specimen has the flocculonodular lobe, you will be asked to show you that, to show the examiner that. Now, therefore, we have discussed about the superior surface and the inferior surface of the cerebellum. I have already said the anterior lobe is still the primary fissure. So, the anterior lobe, when we are discussing the anterior lobe, it is anterior to the fissura prima. Now, what are the parts we have? We can see in this diagram on your right that it has multiple colors. It has light green, it has light yellow, it has pinkish fuchsia color. Now see, the vermis, color of the vermis corresponds with the color of the hemisphere. That is why it is said that the vermis has certain parts which has corresponding parts on the cerebellar hemispheres. But then the there are anteriorly or superiorly near the anterosuperior notch, you can see a black coloring. Posterior inferior notch, you can also see a black coloring. These do not have corresponding hemispherical parts. Therefore, this black anterosuperiorly is the lingula. Lingula does not have any lateral extension where on the corresponding cerebellar hemisphere. So lingula, we start now talking about the parts of the vermis. So lingula does not have any corresponding hemispherical part. Coming to the next part is the central lobule. So adjacent to lingula now it is central lobule, which has the corresponding hemispherical part is the ala of the cerebellum. Then the part is the culmen. Culmen has the anterior quadrangular lobule, and then posteriorly is the fissura prima. Now, you have to remember the diagrammatic representation of the parts of vermis, corresponding parts on the cerebellar hemisphere. Just remembering and naming them won't be suffice, because you have to color the parts of the vermis and put corresponding colors on the corresponding cerebellar hemispherical portions. Therefore, to remind you once again, a quick recapitulation: lingula does not have any lateral extension. Central lobule has the ala. Culmen has the anterior quadrangular lobule. Then we have the fissura prima. So if you get a short note on anterior lobe, you have to write till this part. Going to the posterior lobe. So our posterior lobe is posterior to the primary fissure. Now I will describe it in 2 slides, because we first see posterior lobe from the fissura prima to the horizontal fissure. So what do we get here? We get the declive. The declive is a part on the vermis, and on the hemisphere we get the posterior quadrangular lobule. Then is the folium. It is superior semilunar lobule on the cerebellar hemisphere. This superior semilunar lobule, the other name for it is lobular simplex. Now, my dear students, you have to remember the other names also, because sometimes examiners have a tendency to ask where is lobular simplex, or what is lobular simplex, to which you will say that it is the superior semilunar lobule on the cerebellar hemisphere, and the corresponding part on the vermis is the folia. Therefore, after this, behind this, you will get the horizontal fissure. So the first part of the posterior lobe starts with the posterior quadrangular lobule on the cerebellar hemisphere, and the superior semilunar lobule on the cerebellar hemisphere, with corresponding vermis portions as the declive and the folium respectively. Let us go to the next slide. The next slide is the posterior lobe horizontal fissure to the posterolateral sulcus. I'm sure you are not getting confused because posterior to fissura prima up to the posterolateral sulcus is the posterior lobe or the middle lobe. For your understanding purpose, I have divided into 2 slides so that you can remember it better. Now, just you can see the horizontal fissure. Just adjacent to the horizontal fissure, the cerebellar hemispherical part is the inferior semilunar lobule, and the corresponding part on the vermis is the tuber. Below it is the pyramid, which has the biventral lobule, and then uvula, which has tonsil. And then we have the posterolateral fissure. So, this horizontal fissure has divided the cerebellum into superior and inferior halves, or proximal and distal halves. So what are the parts in the distal halves you got? You got the inferior semilunar lobule, biventral lobule and tonsil on the cerebellar hemispherical part, and the tuber pyramidivula on the vermis part. Just behind it is the posterolateral fissure, and adjacent to it is the flocculonodular lobe, and the part of the corresponding part on the vermis is the nodule. Therefore, what you can see here is the parts from the vermis from anterior to posterior. That is, you can see the first is the we start with the lingula and we end with the nodule. Now, this is the parts on the vermis, and we have the corresponding parts on the cerebellar hemisphere. Why did I go slow here is this diagram is a mandatory one to practice, because this is quite often asked, not only theoretically, but also in practical and oral. And you can get multiple MCQs. You can make your own MCQs, and you can get multiple MCQs related to hemisphere and the vermis. Coming to the nuclei of the cerebellum. Now, this nuclei of the cerebellum is, you can see in this diagram, the cerebellum has compact masses of gray matter in the core of white matter. So you can see peripherally gray matter, you can see the white matter, and you can see one crenated nucleus. Then there are 2 other nuclei. Then there are 2 round nucleus. So all these are compact masses of gray matter in the core of white matter. These are 4 on either side. So total nuclei are 8. But when you are writing, your examiner will ask you, enumerate the nuclei of cerebellum, where the examiner will want you to write in a chronological order, either from lateral to medial or from medial to lateral. But it has to be sequentially placed and it has to be chronological. I'm sure you can understand it. Now see, if we start from lateral to medial, you will see that there is a crenated nucleus here. This crenated nucleus is the largest nucleus. It is the lateralmost nucleus. Therefore, it is called dentate nucleus. This crenation, this reminds one of the dentine part, the dentations. So, this is the crenations which we call the dentate nucleus. Then we have the emboliform nucleus, which is oval. Look at the structure, this is oval. Then round is globose. Globose is round, global. And then is the purple colored nucleus, which you can see. This is known as fastigial nucleus. Now see, this emboliform and globose are sometimes together known as nucleus interpositus. Now, this can also come as an important MCQ. You are asked to practice this diagram. If you get it in exam and you label it as dentate, instead of emboliform and globose, you write nucleus interpositus and fastigial nucleus. It will not do. You will have to identify each nucleus and then you can put a third bracket and write nucleus interpositus for the globose and emboliform. So there are three most important things related to this slide. One is these are compact masses of gray matter in the white core of cerebellum. Number two is the nuclei are arranged either lateral to medial, you say, or medial to lateral, but sequentially and chronologically. The nuclei you start if you are going from lateral to medial will be dentate, emboliform, globose, and fastigial. So this is very important because dentate is the largest and the lateralmost nucleus. The emboliform is like an embolus. So it is oval. Globose is global. So it is round and fastigial. Fastigial is like a tent basically. So you can see all four nuclei. Color them up as it has been colored. And you can put same color for globose and emboliform because together they are known as nucleus interpositus. This is an important slide. We will see why this is very important. Coming to the next slide. Next slide says phylogeny versus functional difference. What is this phylogeny? Now see how a man started walking. We didn't start walking on the first day of our evolution. We learned to sit, to crawl, then to stand with support, then stand erect, then without support, and then we could run. Now this was, I can take you back to the Stone Age, the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, and the New Stone Age. So the Stone Age it can be related even in anatomy. The oldest part of the functional value added to our cerebellum is the archicerebellum. Archi means old, very old, the oldest. So it's the most primitive part. Now, therefore, you can see that what should have been the most primitive? That we could balance ourselves. If we are sitting, we are not falling. If you are crawling, we can balance ourselves. If you are standing, we can stand and we don't fall. That is maintenance of equilibrium and balance. Therefore, this is done through the vestibulocerebellar fibers. What are the parts of the cerebellum concerned with this? So, the cerebellum, as you now know, it has the vermis, it has the cerebellar hemispheres. Therefore, the cerebellar part is the, the fastigial nucleus, that's the nucleus, then the flocculonodular lobe and the lingula. So lingula, flocculonodular lobe and the fastigial nucleus. So these are the three structures which are the most primitive to start to arise in our body, in our cerebellum, and we learned how to stand, how to balance ourselves, how to maintain equilibrium, how not to fall, but to keep ourselves erect. So this is very important. I will tell the probable question after this. You must remember that the archicerebellum is the most primitive cerebellum concerned with the equilibrium and balance, the vestibulocerebellar fibers, and the parts are the lingula, flocculonodular lobe, and the fastigial nucleus. Similarly, in the second slide, you can see the Paleocerebellum. That means we can now stand, we can maintain our posture, and we can maintain our muscle tone. This is a very important motor function. And this is done through the spinocerebellar fibers. So Archie was the vestibulocerebellar, and this paleocerebellum is by the spinocerebellar fibers. So what are the parts here? The central lobule, ala, culmen, and anterior quadrangular lobule. Then the pyramid, uvula, and nucleus interpositus, that is the globose and the emboliform. So it is concerned with the maintaining muscle tone and posture. The neocerebellum is the latest, the newest part of the cerebellum, which has the middle and posterior lobe except pyramid and the uvula. The dentate nucleus, the largest nucleus you saw, the dentate nucleus, the yellow structure on the diagram on your right, the topmost diagram, you can see the crenated nucleus. Now this is the corticopontocerebellar fibers. What does it do? We all have voluntary, smooth and skilled movements. So this maintains the coordination. So automatically you can understand that a probable question is correlate parts of cerebellar hemisphere or vermis with the functional and the phylogenetic phylogenetic aspect, where you write about the archie, paleo, and the neocerebellum, the three types of fibers, the vestibulocerebellar, the spinocerebellar, and the corticopontocerebellar fibers. And then the functional is the maintenance of equilibrium, then the maintenance of posture, and the smooth and skilled movements. So this is a very, very important question, in which aspect you must practice these two diagrams. Now I will show you this flow chart. For your remembering purpose, you can quickly make your own flow chart. That is, the phylogenetic division is archie, paleo, neo. Anatomical component are the different parts on the vermis and the cerebellum. Chief connection are the vestibulocerebellar, the spinocerebellar, and the corticopontocerebellar. You know the functions as the body equilibrium, the muscle tone, and the coordination. And you know the functional classification with the vestibulocerebellum, spinocerebellum, and the cerebropontocerebellar fibers. You can make your own flowchart. Suppose you get a question on this, if you can answer just with this flowchart, it will be sufficient. And then you add the other two diagrams which I showed in the earlier 3 slides. Come to the next. Cerebellum has a connection, now you know, with the parts of the brain stem, because it is dorsal to the pons and the medulla. Now it has 3 peduncles. What does peduncles means? Peduncles are the the trunks which contain the fibers or the tracts. We have the superior peduncle, we have the middle cerebellar peduncle, and we have the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So it connects the midbrain, pons, and medulla. Now these peduncles, they transmit the cerebellopetal and cerebellofugal fibers. What do you mean by the petal? Petal are the afferent fibers, fugal are the efferent fibers. So you remember the centripetal force and the centrifugal force. So it is derived from there. Now, superior cerebellar peduncle, this superior cerebellar peduncle is in relation to the part of the midbrain. It is the thinnest one. It has afferents, very fine afferents, spino-ventral, spinocerebellar, and tectocerebellar fibers. And efferents are dentatorubral. That means from dentate to the red nucleus, dentate to thalamic, from dentate to thalamus. So it has 2 efferents and 2 afferents. In the next slide, it is middle cerebellar peduncle. My dear students, This is, you have to make a note now. See, it has only afferent fibers. You know, most important MCQs can only be made when where you get something exceptional. Middle cerebellar peduncle, which is against the pons, has only afferent fibers. Therefore, you can quickly make your own MCQ. Middle cerebellar peduncle contains. So you can write that it has only afferent fibers. It is the thickest one. It has the automatically, it has cerebellopetal fibers, and it has the pontocerebellar fibers. So you can make out your own, prepare your own MCQ. The inferior cerebellar peduncle has afferents, that is the spinocerebellar fibers, arcuate fibers, cuneocerebellar. Vestibulocerebellar is one which you must remember because we have seen it, how it is related in the archicerebellum. And efferents will be starting from cerebellum, so cerebello-olivary, vestibular, cerebello-reticular fibers. You can make a flowchart of this also. Therefore, white matter of cerebellum consists of three types of fibers. Look at your diagram on the right. It says efferent, afferent, and intrinsic. Efferent and afferent we have already seen. Intrinsic fibers are exit within the cerebellum. So you know that in anatomy we have two terms, extrinsic and intrinsic. Intrinsic limited to the organ itself. Therefore, over here also, the fibers are within the cerebellum. Now, the blood supply of the cerebellum is basically, it is usually dealt with the blood supply of the brain. But nevertheless, I'll just touch upon, this is by three arteries. So you have seen that cerebellum has multiple times we are dealing with three. It has three lobes, it has three arteries, it has three fissures or sulcus. So three arteries are the superior cerebellar artery, which supplies the superior cerebellar peduncle and mainly the cerebellar cortex. Then the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, that is, it supplies the middle cerebellar peduncle and the vestibulocochlear nerve, and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. It supplies the most important is the vestibulocochlear nuclei and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So superior cerebellar artery, superior cerebellar peduncle, anterior inferior cerebellar artery to middle cerebellar peduncle, and posterior inferior cerebellar artery to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, corresponding veins. Therefore, we can see that the functions are, it is the cerebellum is meant for the ipsilateral control of the body, maintains equilibrium or body balance, and muscle tone and posture, and smooth coordination and skilled movements. The lesions can be due to congenital lesions, which can be dysgenesis or hypoplasia, can be due to some trauma if there is a fall on the back which injures the occipital bone, can have a probability of touching upon the cerebellum. Ischemic, that is thrombosis of any cerebellar artery. Degenerative can be due to multiple sclerosis, or neoplastic can be due to medulloblastoma in children or other expanding tumors. Now, expanding tumors of which region? That is, it can be either the brainstem tumors or it can also be tumors in the posterior cranial fossa or middle cranial fossa extending to posterior cranial fossa. Now we start with the clinical part of the topic because clinical part is very important. This is Archicerebellar Syndrome. So what is it? We have seen that it is archicerebellum is lingula flocculonodular lobe. So it can be due to this lesion. Usually it is happening by the medulloblastoma. There will be automatically disorder in equilibrium. That is, the vestibulocerebellar fibers are involved. Three features are very, very important. One is positive Romberg sign. You ask the patient to stand with closed eye. and stand in anatomical position, you will see that there is a tendency to fall. This is unsteadiness in balance. Unsteadiness in gait. What is gait? Gait is the walking style. So it sways side to side. We call it staggering gait. And there is unsteadiness in the head. So unable to keep the head erect, the head swings forwards and backwards. While walking, the patient swings from side to side and head swings from front to back. So this is Archicerebellar Syndrome. So we can see that there is a disorder in equilibrium. That means the vestibulocerebellar fibers are involved. Next is Neocerebellar Syndrome. Now see, Neocerebellar Syndrome includes paleo and neo both. Therefore, what are the fibers which can get damaged? It can be either the spinocerebellar fibers or it can be the cerebropontocerebellar fibers. Now see, in this paleocerebellum, you can see that there can be loss of resilience and there can be fatigue. We call the condition hypotonia leading to asthenia. Excessive fatigue. Fatigue means there is weakness. Now, excessive movement of terminal joints due to loss of stretch reflex is the pendulous knee jerk. There will be, you remember the stretch reflex, which you must have done in physiology, the knee jerk reflex. Now, there will be jerky movements. And postural defect is the head rotated and flexed and shoulder on a lower level on affected side. So in the paleocerebellar syndrome, you have to remember that there is hypotonia, loss of resilience of muscle, asthenia, and pendulous knee jerk, and of course postural defect. These are all due to the spinocerebellar fibers. Going to the neocerebellar syndrome proper. Now, neocerebellar syndrome will obviously affect the dentate nucleus also. So there can be what is the function of neocerebellum is the skilled movement, the smooth coordinated functioning of the skilled movement. Therefore, if it is damaged, we call it cerebellar ataxia. Then the intention tremor, that is there can be abnormal repetitive oscillatory movement, that is buttoning clothes, picking up objects, or dysmetria, finger nose test target, or loss of harmonization or decomposition of movements. This diadochokinesia is a term. You ask the patient to clap. Now you will find that there is a difficulty in pronation and supination. Dysarthria, you ask the name, there will be slurring speech. Nystagmus, the doll's eye movement of the eyeball, the rhythmical oscillation of the eyeball. This is very important. Therefore, when you prepare the question, you will have to read about the neocerebellar syndrome, the features of it. Now coming to the fourth ventricle. Where is the fourth ventricle located? Between the brainstem and the cerebellum. The fourth ventricle is, as usual, a cavity of the hindbrain. It's a diamond-shaped structure. Now, it's a part of the ventricular system, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, and the lateral ventricles. So, it extends from cerebral aqueduct up to the obex. We will see what is obex. Therefore, CSF enters the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct and goes out through the central canal of the spinal cord. It has the choroid plexus in the inferior aspect of the roof of the fourth ventricle. I'm sure you know the choroid plexus, you must have studied about it. Now this choroid plexus has three openings, two laterally by the foramen of Luschka and one median opening in the center, which is known as foramen of Magendie. Now, this diagram is also very important. It is covered by the ependyma. Now, the communications with the third ventricle is, you can see the third ventricle here through the cerebral aqueduct, and with the part of the medulla to spinal cord is the central canal of the spinal cord. Now coming to the roof of the fourth ventricle. Now look at the diagram which is below on your right. The yellow structures are the superior cerebellar peduncle which are connected by the superior medullary velum. The purple structure is the inferior part of the roof of the fourth ventricle, which has the foramen lucida laterally and foramen of Magendie on the median aspect. The tip is known as obex. Therefore, in the first slide for fourth ventricle, we saw that it extends from the aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct to obex. The two ends of the lateral part of the fourth ventricle meet at a point which is known as calamus scriptorius. Calamus scriptorius is like a pen, and script, it is for writing. So it looks like a nib of an ink pen. The floor of the fourth ventricle is again a rhomboid shaped, diamond shaped structure. It has a median sulcus which divides it into right and left halves. You can look at the diagram. Follow. And each right part or the left part is again subdivided by another sulcus known as the sulcus limitans. Now this sulcus limitans, if you follow on the top, it has the superior fovea, and if you see below, it has the inferior fovea. And lateral part of the sulcus limitans is known as the vestibular area. So this is very important. Superior fovea, inferior fovea, and the vestibular area. The floor of the fourth ventricle is against the pons. So it has on the superior, adjacent to superior fovea, it has a little part of the locus ceruleus. What is locus ceruleus? It's the concentration of noradrenaline, and it is superior to superior fovea. It gives a sky blue appearance. Now, internal part of the facial nerve bulges, forming the facial colliculus. You can see two big oval shaped nuclei. These are the facial colliculus, and this loops around the abducens nucleus, and this feature is known as neurobiotaxis. So the looping around the abducens nucleus is known as neurobiotaxis. Now coming to the medullary part, horizontally you can get the stria medullaris. Now these stria medullaris runs across the floor transversely. Below you get the hypoglossal nuclei and the vagal nuclei. So there are two nuclei. So what do you get in the floor? Above stria medullaris, you get the facial colliculus, the superior fovea, locus ceruleus, vestibular area. Inferior to stria medullaris, you get the inferior fovea, hypoglossal triangle, and the vagal triangle. My dear students, I would like you to remember this, because when we do the clinical anatomy of fourth ventricle, we will require this. Now coming to the clinical anatomy, you know that there can be, because it is covered by ependyma, there can be ependymomal tumors. Since it has the cerebellar peduncle, so it can, and it is against the pons, you have the cerebellopontine angle tumors. You can see that there are facial colliculus, there is vestibular area, there is hypoglossal triangle, there is vagal triangle. So automatically there are relations to vital centers. Fourth ventricle is concerned with CSF circulation through the foramen of Magendie, foramen of Luschka, through the cerebral aqueduct with the third ventricle, and also with the lateral ventricle. Now, therefore, there is CSF circulation. Now, medulloblastoma, we have just dealt in the cerebellum. Therefore, we can see, since so many vital centers are there, therefore, it can have, medulloblastoma can lead to pressure on the hypoglossal, on the vagal triangles, leading to on the vestibular area, leading to cardiovascular functions, difficulty in respiration, disturbed swallowing, disturbed movement of tongue, disturbed equilibrium, balance, tonicity in coordination of movement. So whatever you read in the Archicerebellum, Paleocerebellum, Neocerebellum can also be attached to the clinical anatomy of the fourth ventricle when there is a medulloblastoma. We just dealt with medulloblastoma in relation to cerebellum. There can be occlusion or obstruction of any of these foramina, cerebral aqueduct, central canal of spinal cord, foramina magenti, foramina Liushka. What happens? The CSF gets accumulated in the ventricular cavity. And when the CSF gets accumulated, there is a dilatation of the ventricular system due to overaccumulation of CSF, and it is known as internal hydrocephalus. So, what is hydrocephalus? That is the increased circulation of CSF leading to increased accumulation of CSF, leading to the ventricular system getting dilated. So this is a clinical condition which is commonly found. Therefore, if I have to draw a quick summary of the cerebellum, you have to remember the parts of the vermis along with the cerebellar hemispheres. You have to remember the fissures and the flocculonodular lobe. You then remember the nuclei of the cerebellum from lateral to medial in chronological order. Third is what are the three arteries which are supplying the cerebellum and the three peduncles with the fibers which are present in the cerebellum. The next part is the archicerebellum, the neocerebellum, and the paleocerebellum. What are the fibers? What are the parts? What are the functions? You have to remember this. Then comes the clinical part. Of course, correlating the phylogeny with the functional importance is the clinical aspect. And then you can see that coming to the fourth ventricle, which is a structure between the brainstem and the cerebellum, you can see that the fourth ventricle has connections with the third ventricle, with the canal of the spinal cord, with the foramina Blushka and Magenti. And so you can see the circulation, which can be again attached to the hydrocephalus or medulloblastoma, thereby affecting the various vital centers which are present in the floor of the third ventricle. Now, my dear students, you have three ventricles to do: third ventricle, lateral ventricle, and fourth ventricle. Please do each one of them because these are potential questions and must-know areas. And practice label diagram of the roof and the floor of fourth ventricle. Divide it into right and floor of fourth ventricle, divide it into right and left halves with the sulcus, medial sulcus, then divide each half by the sulcus limitans. Lateral part is the vestibular area. In the medial part, draw the facial colliculus. Then topmost part is the superior fovea. Adjacent to it is the locus ceruleus, which contains noradrenaline. Below, inferiorly, horizontally draw the stria medullaris. Inferior to it, draw the hypoglossal triangle, the vagal triangle. Adjacent to it is the inferior fovea. So if you have an idea of this diagram, then nothing is impossible when you do the clinical anatomy, because when there is a medulloblastoma and there is pressure on the vital centers, you know there is cardiovascular dysfunction, you know there is swallowing dysfunction, you know everything, you know, because there is the spinocerebellar fibers will be affected, corticopontocerebellar fibers will be affected, and the vestibulocerebellar fibers will be affected. So I have also provided a few questions which I will like you all to practice. But besides this, I want all my students to make MCQs. You only make your own MCQs. There cannot be any MCQs which can be outside. MCQs are all hidden within the topic, and as you go on reading it, please practice the MCQs. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank
So,
you.
actually, we have in the YouTube chat section. If any
Okay.
doubts, you can type in the YouTube section, and also your students are in the Zoom also, ma'am. 15 of the students. So if you have any doubts, you can raise your hands. I will unmute so that you can ask the questions. So either you can type in the YouTube chat section, or you can raise your hands. I will unmute and you can ask your questions. Maybe we can wait another few minutes, ma'am.
Okay, okay, no problem.
Friends, meanwhile, as you type your doubts, I request you all to share the YouTube channel to all your friends. It's www.tinyurl.com/Indian Medical College 2020, and also like our Facebook page for the regular class schedule, www.fb.com/Indian Medical College 2020. Ma'am has given a few questions and MCQs, which we will be sharing by night in the FB page along with the video. So you can access those questions in the night. So please do like our Facebook page and try to find answers for the questions which ma'am has given. And we do have upcoming sessions at 5 to 6 p.m. on soft skills for doctors, a very common topic which will be useful for every one of you. And urea cycle, very good biochemistry topic at 6:30 to 7:30. So stay tuned for those. And similarly, Friday, you have one more anatomy class on dural venous sinuses at the same time, 3 to 4 p.m. And 5 to 6, we have opioid analgesics part 1 pharmacology. And 6:30 to 7:30, we have an ENT topic on tuning folk test. So stay tuned to on this time slots, and also share the YouTube channel to all your seniors also who it might be helpful. And
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
One girl, Anjana, has asked a doubt.
Yeah.
Asked, ma'am, in fourth ventricle, are features of floor important to write?
Yes, yes, it's very important. In fact, ask her. I have already given the question in the short answer form. It is very important, and every question should be assisted by a diagram.
Okay. And other questions, we will share it, ma'am, to the Facebook page. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Balaji.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And I thank all audience for enjoying the session. Thank you.
Thank you.